Chapter 4. It Snows Too Much, even for Berk. Berk was rarely an uneventful place. Even on the most peaceful days, there were always tasks to take care of, weapons to sharpen, crops to tend to, fish to feed, and so on. And then there were the dragons, of course, but the dragons alone couldn't be blamed for Berk's lack of peace and quiet. No, that was definitely the Berkians inhabiting this little island's fault, with their hot heads and inability to solve problems without yelling and throwing punches. But it was Berk. It was home. The fact that it rarely was uneventful wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Even so, Hiccup thought it was a little bit over the top to only give him a week's worth of rest after coming back from the edge before something weird happened. Weird, even for Berk's standards. A snowstorm broke out over the island, completely out of the blue, with almost as much force as devastating winter had to offer. Sure, the climate on Berk wasn't always reliable, the wind and the rain coming and going erratically as they pleased, but this was completely out of the ordinary. Hiccup didn't really have an answer for what could have caused it, and his only suggestion sounded stupid even before Astrid pointed it out. "But the snow wraith doesn't cause blizzards," she yelled over the wind. "Besides, how could it have come to Berk without anyone noticing?" "And why would it have come to Berk in the first place?" Hiccup asked back. "I don't know, but it has to be some kind of dragon. What else could it be? I mean, summer's barely over. This isn't normal." "Maybe the gods are angry with us," Astrid pondered, and sounded only half serious. Hiccup didn't answer, but the idea that they'd have to play another round of which god did we piss off this time and what did we do wasn't it particularly tempting. Instead, he tried scouting through the heavily falling snow. He knew they were somewhere on the other side of the island, but where exactly was impossible to tell. "Do you see anything, Bart?" he asked Toothless. Toothless replied with a vague grumble before he opened his mouth wide and roared. His ears twitched and turned for a few seconds. Hiccup also tried listening in case the might-be-a-dragon reacted to Toothless's roar, but he heard nothing. They continued soaring forward. "Weird," Hiccup muttered to himself. "Maybe just the weather after—" "Whoa, Toothless!" Toothless suddenly halted in mid-air, making Hiccup crash into him. He pushed himself up and looked around for what had made Toothless stop like that, but couldn't see anything. Beside him, Astrid seemed to have the same problem. Stormfly was tilting her head from side to side in that bird-like way of hers, as if she had also noticed whatever Toothless had. "What is it, Bud?" Hiccup asked. Toothless's eyes stared ahead. No, not ahead. Hiccup realized he was following something with his eyes. Something that was moving through the air. Toothless gave a low rumble before he suddenly jerked into action. Hiccup yelped as they dove downwards, and he faintly heard Astrid doing the same behind him. "Toothless, what are you—" he started, but was promptly ignored when he tried to take the reins again. Instead, he just held on to the saddle and once again tried spotting whatever it was Toothless was seeing. But all he saw was snow. Still, Toothless flew purposefully through the biting wind, and Hiccup couldn't do anything but let him lead the way. They were close to the ground now. All he could see were trees hanging low under the weight of snow and nothing else. No dragon, no animals, just wait. "Astrid!" he called, voice breaking in surprise. Something blue was lying in the snow down below. Toothless was flying straight towards it. "Down there!" "Is that—" Astrid started, voice barely audible in the wind. "A person," Hiccup finished, and got ready to jump off of Toothless once they landed. It had barely been snowing for an hour, but it still reached Hiccup's knees, and he struggled through it to get to the unmoving figure on the ground. There was a coldness in his gut, unlike the one around them. If this person had been lying here in the blizzard like this— He shook his head, hurrying towards them. Astrid was right behind him. Now that they were closer, he could see a head of brown hair, though it was almost completely covered with snow. A boy, he realized, probably not much younger than himself. He was pale and wore only some kind of strange-looking tunic and ragged brown pants that were cut short by his ankles. With a small jolt, Hiccup saw he wasn't even wearing shoes. "Hello?" he tried calling out, even if he highly doubted he would get any answer. The boy didn't move. Meanwhile, Toothless and Stormfly seemed content to just watching from afar. If Hiccup didn't know better, he'd think they looked almost— He didn't know exactly what he could call it. Curious, definitely. but there was something ominous about the way they were watching them inch closer to the stranger. Hiccup dropped down by the boy's side and began turning him over. A voice in the back of his head kept saying the boy was already dead, but he tried his best to ignore it, instead focusing on getting his face out of the snow. What he didn't expect was for the boy to suddenly open his eyes, heaving a weak, raspy breath. Hiccup almost jerked backwards in alarm when a pale hand clamped around his wrist. The boy looked like he was barely lucid. His eyes were wide, and he seemed to struggle focusing on Hiccup. Even so, his hold was tight, and his gaze intense. His chapped lips parted, but no sound came out. It didn't matter. Hiccup understood a plea for help when he saw it. And then Astrid gave a horrified gasp. "Hiccup!" she hissed. "Look!" Hiccup followed her gaze, and there, partly covered in snow and the boy's body, was another head of brown hair. His heart gave a jolt when he realized it was just a child, dressed only slightly better than the older boy, but it was far from enough to survive the cold out here. He looked back at the older boy. His brown eyes were struggling to remain open, and his trembling body was slowly sinking back into the snow. Hiccup decided they could ask questions later. "Come on, we have to help them," he said. "Of course we do," Astrid said. She sounded angry, but Hiccup knew it was just because she was worried. She was already moving around the older boy to get to the kid. Hiccup sent the other boy what he hoped was a reassuring look. "Don't worry, you'll be okay," he told him. The boy didn't answer, but it seemed Hiccup's promise was enough. His eyes closed and his body went limp. Without any time to lose, Hiccup carefully lifted the older boy into his arms, scanning his body for any wounds or fractures. The boy was skinny and frail, and as he lifted him up, his eyes started to something else following the boy out of the snow. A long wooden stick that was hooked at the end. There was nothing special about it, but somehow the boy was gripping it, even while unconscious. Hiccup could only assume it was important. "Hiccup, come on!" Astrid yelled, and Hiccup quickly balanced the stick on the boy's chest before calling for Toothless. Despite the dragon's previous reluctance to come close, they seemed eager to help now. It took a bit of work, but they eventually got to the skies, with the older boy in front of Hiccup and Toothless, and the kid on Stormfly, tucked close to Astrid's chest. If Hiccup had known they would find a couple of frozen strangers when they'd flown out today, he would have brought some extra clothes, or at the very least, some shoes for this guy. What kind of person walks around in the barbaric archipelago without shoes anyway? As for the storm, it had already started to calm down, disappearing as fast as it had appeared. Hiccup couldn't say he wasn't grateful, but it still made this whole situation feel even stranger than it already was. But he had an ice-cold, almost lifeless body resting against him, so pondering about the weather would have to wait. The ride back to the village was much quicker than on the way out, partly because they were in a hurry, and partly because the snowstorm was rapidly coming to an end. By the time the village was below them, it had subsided to only some mild wind and gently falling snowflakes. "We should take them to Gothi," Astrid said. "And then go tell my dad what happened," Hiccup muttered grimly, glancing down at the pale face of the boy. Even if he knew it was unwise to let these strangers into Berk without knowing who they were or where they came from, they'd have to deal with those consequences later. Whether or not his father agreed with their decision didn't matter at the moment. Gothi was the boy's best shot at recovery. Stormfrey let Astrid down on Gothi's balcony first, before she took off again to make space for Toothless. Hiccup climbed off as carefully as possible, trying not to jostle the boy or drop him. "Gothi!" Astrid yelled, pounding on the door. Had the circumstances been different, Hiccup might have advised her to calm down, but as it was, her urgency was justified. The door opened a few seconds later, revealing Gothi and a few of her many terrible terrors. Gothi's face was pulled into an irritated frown, but it quickly changed when she saw the two unconscious bodies in their arms. "They're freezing cold," Hiccup said. "We found them in the storm. Can you help them?" Astrid asked. Gothi didn't reply. Of course she didn't, but stepped aside to let them in. Astrid and Hiccup entered, and once Gothi had closed the door behind them, she wobbled over to a huge chest. From it, she pulled out fur skins and blankets, placing them next to the hearth, where fire was already burning. Gothi looked at the two boys and motioned for Astrid and Hiccup to lay them on the furs before she hurried across the room to the herbs and healing equipment, rummaging around for something. Hiccup didn't pretend to understand what she was doing, but as the village healer, she'd helped them multiple times before. So instead of asking questions, he and Astrid made sure the two boys were warm by the fire. Hiccup checked one last time if the boys had any injuries, but for now it seemed there was nothing more they could do to help. When Gothi turned to them and looked pointedly at the door, Hiccup supposed she had it under control. At least, he hoped she did. "It makes no sense," Astrid said once they were back on the dragons, descending towards the great hall. She was staring straight ahead, brows furrowed and gaze distant. "A storm blows up from out of nowhere, nobody sees anyone fly into or off the island, and either way, how would anyone be able to get anywhere in the storm in the first place? And then those two..." She shook her head. "There's something iffy about it all." "Maybe someone dropped them there," Hiccup pondered grimly. "But why?" Astrid asked as they landed on the stairs of the great hall. "Could it be a trap?" "Maybe," Hiccup said, though he hated to consider it. 1 week was far from enough time to recover after the last clash with Johann and his accomplices. He put his hand on the door, but didn't push it open just yet. "We never did find out where Krogan disappeared." Astrid's expression became tight with contempt. "Even if it was Krogan, that doesn't explain the storm," she said. "And the fact that those boys were in the middle of it? It can't be a coincidence, can it?" "Are you saying someone created that storm?" Hiccup asked. "Don't be stupid," Astrid muttered, but looked up to the sky with a somber expression. I just think it's weird." Hiccup followed her gaze, feeling the gears turn in his brain as he tried making sense of the whole thing. A headache was coming on, thumping in the back of his head. He thought about the boy and how he'd opened his eyes just as Hiccup touched him. It hadn't felt like someone with malicious intent. The boy had seemed terrified and nothing short of desperate. He'd held out long enough to make sure they were found. Hiccup hoped it wasn't all for nothing. He let out a deep sigh. "Yeah, you and me both," he murmured as he finally pushed the doors open. Stoic was in the midst of arguing with Spiteloud, but they both shut up at the sight of Hiccup and Astrid entering. "Ah, there you are," Stoic said, getting to his feet. The bags under his eyes seemed heavier than normal, and there was a deep, tired frown on his face. Hiccup could tell he was still weakened after being bedridden. "I hope you have some good news to make up for the destruction that blizzard caused." Hiccup pressed his lips together, knowing very well that they had none. He braced himself for Stoic's reaction to hearing that his day might have just gone from bad to worse. Beside him, Astrid sent him a faint, sympathetic smile as Hiccup took a deep breath. Well, not exactly." It didn't take long before the whole village was talking about their new unconscious guests. That would have been completely fine, hadn't it been for the fact that each time Hiccup walked past someone, muttering and gossiping together, he kept picking up new details about the story that he definitely didn't remember happening, nor did he understand where they got this information, though he had a sneaking suspicion the twins had something to do with it. Somewhere in between fixing up the mess the storm had left behind and dinner time, Hiccup had heard every theory, ranging from Krogan's return to something about the wrath of the gods, to something even more absurd about human sacrifice, and everything in between. The adults were speaking in wary tones about spies and invaders, while children were scaring each other with stories of wicked fays and wraiths. All in all, Hiccup doubted the two strangers would get an exceptionally warm welcome once they woke up. As it was, he was very grateful for Gothi's silence. The only thing she informed them of was the fact that the boys were alive. Not awake, but alive. "But you said one of them touched you when you found them, right?" asked Fishlegs while they were eating dinner. "For the last time, we're not discussing this until we know more about the situation," Hiccup said, pointing his dinner knife at Fishlegs. "But what if... No what ifs. We didn't go around gossiping about Heather when we saved her, so why should we do so now?" Hiccup asked. "Speak for yourself," Roughnut snorted. "To be fair, Heather wasn't exactly as innocent as we thought she was," Snotlout countered, and ignored the look Hiccup sent him. "If anything, we should try to figure out as much as possible about those guys before they wake up, so we have the upper hand." "But there's nothing to find out," Astrid said sternly. "We have no clues whatsoever where they came from. Not even their clothes look like anything we've seen before." "Suspicious indeed," Toughnut said. "Didn't you say they were barefoot too?" Hiccup shrugged. "One of them, yeah. But what does that have to do with anything?" he asked, and when the twins shared knowing glances, Hiccup quickly waved his hands. "You know what? Never mind. Forget I asked. We are not talking about this, all right? We just wait for them to wake up, and then we can start asking questions." The others didn't look too happy about that, and didn't try the slightest to hide it. Astrid scowled at them. Guys, one of them was just a kid. He couldn't have been older than, 13? 12? It's genius, Toughnut exclaimed. No one would ever suspect a child. Hiccup rolled his eyes. I said we aren't talking about this, he repeated. He ignored the part of him that was paranoid enough to agree with Toughnut's theory. When darkness draped itself over Berk, Hiccup was quick to realize that he wouldn't be getting much sleep tonight. Not because of any outside disturbances, though his dad's snoring was particularly thunderous this evening, but because of the ever-rushing thoughts in his head. It was pointless. Just a never-ending stream of whats and whys and hows that he knew he wasn't able to answer at the moment anyway. In the end, he didn't think he got any more than a few hours of light sleep before Toothless nudged him awake in the morning, pestering him about the usual morning flight. Toothless, come on, he grumbled, turning away from him. I just closed my eyes. Toothless grumbled right back at him and started headbutting Hiccup in the back instead, gradually pushing him towards the edge of the bed. Hiccup let out a long sigh, realizing this battle was already lost. It was time to get up anyway. All right, I'm awake. God, you're grumpy in the mornings. Hiccup sluggishly pushed himself up and yawned, and Toothless burbled contentedly before he jumped out through the window to wait for Hiccup outside. As tempting as it was to just crawl back under his blanket, Hiccup rubbed the drowsiness out of his eyes instead and picked up his prosthetic leg from where he dropped it on the floor last night. Somehow, it's more comfortable up here than it was in my bed, Hiccup commented once he and Toothless were in the air, rubbing Toothless's head affectionately. At least it seems one of us slept well. Toothless gave a growl in agreement. Hiccup chuckled. Let's take a lap around the island first, he told him, and then we can have some fun. It seemed like a good deal, because Toothless sped up and set course for the coast, the village getting further and further away below them. Hiccup kept his eyes trained on the ground and the ocean around them as they flew, looking for some sign of life that didn't belong on Berk. Strange ships or signs of campfires or anything that could give him a clue about where those boys had come from. But he found nothing, nor did he find any dragon that might have caused a blizzard. Not that he thought that could be the case. Never had he heard of a dragon able to cause a blizzard. Sure, there were dragons that thrived in them, like the snow wraith, but even that dragon couldn't make the sky cloud over and the wind pick up. He thought of the Skrill, but the Skrill also just used the weather to harvest its power. It didn't create the thunderstorm. So the possibility that a dragon was the culprit was slim, but a part of him insisted that they still didn't know enough about dragons to rule it out completely. Even if it had been a weather-controlling dragon somehow, it was evidently gone now. There were no signs of it, and the snow had already begun melting. Either way, why couldn't he just be content with the assumption that it had just been a natural occurrence, even if it was completely unprecedented? Weather-controlling dragon, Hiccup muttered, shaking his head. It is ridiculous, right, bud? Maybe the gods really are angry with us. If so, it looks like they forgave us already. I wonder what we did to... He trailed off. He thought about the boys in the snow, the mysterious appearance, and how Hiccup and Astrid hadn't been able to identify their clothes. Especially the little boy's clothing had been unlike anything Hiccup had ever seen. But the older boy bewildered him just as much, with his bare feet and everything. Toothless gave a low growl, sending Hiccup a sideways look. It was as if he knew what Hiccup was thinking, or at least that he was thinking very hard about something. The blizzard... Hiccup started, thinking out loud to check if it sounded crazy or not. It came and went so quickly, but in the midst of it all, we find those boys. Then, soon after we decided to help them, the storm came to an end. Maybe the twins were starting to affect him. Maybe it wasn't anything we did. Maybe those boys are... What? Gods? Demigods? God sent? Hiccup closed his eyes and shook his head to get rid of the thought. Toothless cooed, as if asking a question. No, you're right, Hiccup said. That sounds absolutely bonkers. He refused to let the gossip of the village get to him. Heather's arrival had been strange as well, and it turned out to be a completely logical explanation for it. Not a good one exactly, but a logical one, and the truth would probably become clear once the boys woke up. No weather-controlling dragons or demigods or anything like that. They finished the lap around the island, and then they went for a spin as he'd promised. Hiccup liked to tell the others that this was training and that he was responsible, and that was why he was up here so often, alone with Toothless. Of course, everyone knew that was only half the truth. Hiccup wanted to go on the morning flights as much as Toothless did, mostly just so they could fool around and have fun and forget about their worries for a little while. Even so, when Hiccup's cheeks were flushed, his hair windswept and his body aching delightfully from clinging onto the saddle, while Toothless made loops and barrel rolls, Hiccup found himself steering Toothless towards the place they'd found the boys yesterday. He searched the ground, looking for some kind of anomaly, but all he saw was patches of melting snow. There was nothing special about the place, just grass and trees and stones looking exactly the same as the rest of the woods. Hiccup was about to turn around when he spotted something in the corner of his eye, some kind of light. He turned around and squinted, trying to spot it again. There, in the middle of the ground, something was shimmering in the snow, reflecting the morning sun. "Down there, bud," Hiccup said, and they dove towards it. Once they were on the ground, Hiccup climbed off Toothless, and the two of them walked closer to the reflective object. Hiccup frowned. "A crystal?" he muttered, and gingerly picked it up. The crystal was transparent, but Hiccup could spot a slight hue of blue in it. It was small and had several sharp ends, clearly uncut. He smiled at Toothless, holding the crystal out to him. "Pretty, right?" Toothless just tilted his head to the side, following the crystal with his huge green eyes. Hiccup walked over to the saddle and pocketed the crystal and the satchel hanging from it, along with the spare tail fins in his leg. "All right, I guess we should get back," Hiccup said, and climbed onto Toothless again. He looked around one last time. The thoughts from before still lingered in his head, no matter how ridiculous it sounded. He would just have to wait until the boys woke up. And when he looked up into the sky and saw how high the sun had risen, realizing that they'd been out here for quite some time already, he supposed he should go check on them. As the chief's son, of course, not because he wanted to satiate his own curiosity or anything. The strange boy stood with his back to Hiccup by Gothi's table. He was holding a knife, looking at his reflection, it seemed. Clearly, something was wrong, even if the boy had told him he was all right. Which was weird, because he had seemed all right just seconds ago. But right after Hiccup had explained what happened, his whole demeanor had changed. Maybe the events of yesterday were just now coming back to him. Hiccup didn't know what to do. He thought back to the time they'd found Heather, but it had been easier with her. She wasn't as... well, Hiccup felt bad calling the boy weird, but he was. From the very first moment Hiccup had seen him, he'd been weird, with all his staring and muttering and the way he kept looking into thin air. Hiccup was starting to get a feeling this boy wasn't quite present. On the bright side, at least it didn't seem like he had the same kind of crazy as Dagger did. Hiccup inwardly shook his head. This wasn't the time to think about stuff like that. Weird or not, Hiccup had brought this boy here. It was his responsibility to help him. "Hey," he said softly, taking a few steps towards him. "It's all right. This must all be very confusing. But if there's anything I can do to help..." "It's confusing, all right," the boy mumbled. He had a strange accent. Hiccup slowly walked up to him, a little wary of the knife he was holding. "Do you need anything? Water, maybe?" he asked. The boy put down the knife and turned around. He seemed somehow even paler than before, and there was a kind of dread in his expression. But with what was obviously a conscious effort, he smiled. "Water would be good," he replied. His voice was thin. Hiccup nodded and headed for the door. "I think I saw Gothi had some water cooling outside," he said, pulling the door open. "If not, I have some in my whoa, Toothless!" Toothless's giant green eyes stared back at him, his body blocking the entrance. He tilted his head in a silent question, as if asking Hiccup what was taking him so long. Hiccup was about to gently shoo him outside, but the quiet gasp behind them made him stop. He turned around to see the boy staring at Toothless with wide eyes. He started saying something in his language, but then shook his head, eyes flickering rapidly between Hiccup and Toothless. "It's, you gave it a name?" he stammered. Hiccup smiled. "Toothless is a he, and yes, he said, and gently put his hands on Toothless when he gave a curious growl.
It's okay. He won't hurt you.
The boy's lips quivered a bit. Toothless, he repeated, sounding a bit out of breath. Okay, Toothless. Toothless. Toothless the dragon. Then he surprised Hiccup with a small laugh. And you're friends with him?
Yeah, it's a long story,
Hiccup said, though the boy's reaction made him wonder.
You have seen a dragon before, right?
The boy's eyes snapped to Hiccup, his eyebrows rising to his hairline. Would it be weird if I hadn't? He asked back. Just how far from home was this guy? Hiccup exchanged a glance with Toothless before he looked back at the boy.
A little, maybe,
he admitted. When the boy didn't move and kept his gaze trained uncertainly at Toothless, Hiccup sent him a smile. He motioned for Toothless to go back outside. Once he did, Hiccup motioned for the boy to follow. The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment it looked like he was going to refuse. But then he looked at Toothless again, and he straightened his back, walking over to Hiccup. Is this a good idea? He asked, a nervous smile growing on his lips.
I'd say so. You'll have a difficult time on Berk if you're not used to dragons,
Hiccup said, leading the boy out onto the balcony. You don't say, the boy muttered, looking at Toothless with wonder in his hazel eyes. Hiccup was happy to see that he didn't cower in fear. In fact, the boy seemed fairly calm in the face of what the Berkians had once called the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself. Maybe the fact that the boy didn't know about that lovely nickname helped.
Hold your hand out like this,
Hiccup said, demonstrating. He held his hand up to Toothless's face, giving him ample space to choose whether or not to meet him halfway.
And let him come to you.
The boy sent him a look, a flash of skepticism passing over his face, but it quickly disappeared. He took a tentative step towards Toothless, following Hiccup's instructions. Toothless looked calmly back at him. The boy took a shaky breath and closed his eyes, turning his head away. He stood completely still. Toothless leaned forward, pressing his nose against the boy's palm, and the boy's eyes fluttered open. He looked back at Toothless, and though the word he whispered was unfamiliar to Hiccup, the awe in it was unmistakable.
See,
Hiccup said.
Toothless won't harm you, right, bud?
He reached over, running his hand over Toothless's scales, and Toothless crooned happily.
Sounds like a yes,
the boy said, laughter in his voice. He let his hand fall, only to bring it up to his forehead. Hiccup watched him with mild worry. He looked tired. Maybe being introduced to a dragon wasn't the best way to recovery. And yet, the boy was smiling. It was a weary smile, but a genuine one. He looked back at Hiccup. Barely out of the bed and I've already pet a dragon. What a day, he laughed, though it sounded a bit feeble. Hiccup smiled sympathetically, studying the boy.
My name is Hiccup,
he said, realizing that he hadn't even introduced himself. The boy looked up, giving him a strange look. Hiccup sighed.
Yes, you got it right.
Hiccup horrendous haddock, he said, leaving out the third part. He held out his arm.
What's your name?
The boy looked down at Hiccup's hand. He hesitated for so long, Hiccup started to worry he had somehow grown a sixth finger or something. But then the boy reached out. Instead of grabbing Hiccup's forearm like he'd expected, the boy took his hand. His hold was gentle, though tightened after a couple of seconds. Jack, the boy started, but cut himself off. He hesitated. Then his lips turned up into a lopsided smile, a little livelier than before.
Jack's an overland, but you can call me Jack.